Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, November 5th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Trump weighs options for Venezuela war. So the Trump administration has developed a series of options for attacking Venezuela, and this was reported by the New York Times on Tuesday. And these are very serious options. I mean, this is war that they are planning, according to this report. These are more leaks from the Trump administration. As we've discussed, part of the strategy here is a psychological operation against Maduro and Venezuela. But at the same time, there is a real push toward war here, a serious military buildup. And even Trump has basically said that they're considering bombing Venezuela. So the report said that one option would involve bombing Venezuelan military facilities with the goal of collapsing military support for Maduro in hopes that it would get him to flee. And the report noted that there are critics of this approach who say that it would likely have the opposite effect and rally the military around Maduro. This idea that they could just start bombing the military and they're all going to say, all right, we give up, and that's it. I mean, doesn't sound like the best plan. And then the second option would be to send special operations forces, such as Navy SEALs or the Army's Delta Force, into Venezuela to kill or capture Maduro. First off, I mean, are they capable of doing that, of just flying into Caracas and grabbing them or killing them? And of course, this would put these U.S. special operators at serious risk. And obviously civilians, in the area, depending on where they go from, would be at risk. Just another thing that kind of sounds a bit fantastical, this idea that they could send in like an extraction team to grab Maduro. And then the third option would involve sending a much larger force into Venezuela to capture airfields and some of Venezuela's infrastructure and oil fields. The Washington Examiner has reported that U.S. military planners believe that they have sufficient forces in the region to seize and hold key strategic facilities inside Venezuela. So they think they have enough troops to do something like that. I know in some of the islands off the coast of Venezuela, they have military bases there. So the Times report said that President Trump is reluctant to back an operation that would put U.S. troops at risk or come with the chance of failure. And for that reason, other plans are being developed that would involve naval drones and long-range weapon systems. If Trump orders an attack on Venezuela, of course, I mean, this is war. If you start bombing their military, if you start bombing the territory, if you send special forces in, if whichever one of these options is war. They're trying to kind of portray it as like some sort of police action here. But it's either this is going to become a full-blown war or they're going to decapitate the government quickly and then sink the country into chaos. They're being sold by the opposition saying, you take out Maduro, everything's going to be fine. It's all going to go smoothly. But there are many reasons to not think that will be the case. And this report cited Trump aides who said that far more planning has gone into striking at the Maduro government than on what it would take to actually govern Venezuela should the operation succeed. So they're not really planning for the aftermath. Trump aides said the president has expressed reservations about attacking Venezuela and that he's asking what the U.S. would get out of it, asking, are we going to get oil here? Apparently that's been his main focus. And so the push to launch this war, of course, is being led by Marco Rubio, also Stephen Miller, who is Trump's essentially his chief foreign policy advisor on immigration and border stuff. He's also pushing for this, even though there's a very good chance that this creates another migrant crisis, from Venezuela. And the administration has asked the Justice Department to come up with some sort of legal justification for the attack. Though any war with Venezuela, without congressional authorization, would be illegal under the Constitution. It's going to be illegal no matter what justification or reasoning they try to cook up here. And we'll get into some of these other details in the next story here. But, as Trump is considering this, so with these reports, you got to keep in mind that these do seem like intentional leaks from the Trump administration. So there could be some, information warfare going on here. They could have already decided on something. But as Trump is considering this, today there was just Tuesday, the big elections here in Virginia. The CIA Democrat lady won the governor seat pretty big margin against the Republican, which, I mean, these elections are really a referendum on the Trump administration. And also Dick Cheney died. I mean, so we'll get into Dick Cheney later on, but Trump's got to think, what is everybody remembered? What is Dick Cheney always going to be remembered for? His role in the invasion of Iraq, of lying the country into war, killing millions of people in Iraq, and how many Americans, soldiers, and shattering their lives. If Trump starts some big disastrous war in Venezuela, that's unpopular. The polls show that Americans are not interested in this. Yeah, it could be his legacy as well. All right, so the next one here, the USS Gerald Ford leaves Mediterranean bound for Venezuela. So the USS Gerald Ford, which is the world's largest aircraft carrier, has left the Mediterranean Sea and is bound for waters near Venezuela as the U.S. continues its military buildup and this push toward regime change war. So the Pentagon first announced on October 24th that it was deploying the Gerald Ford and its strike group to U.S. Southern Command's area of responsibility. The carrier transited through the Strait of Gibraltar on Tuesday and is now in the Atlantic Ocean, according to ship trackers. The voyage is expected to take about a week, and the Gerald Ford and its strike group will join 8 U.S. warships currently operating in the Caribbean. And I mean, this is a huge force that they already have, and now they're adding an aircraft carrier to it. And this is what they were using to bomb Yemen primarily. They're also firing Tomahawk missiles from U.S. Navy destroyers and running airstrikes from aircraft carriers. So they're getting positioned here for a major bombing campaign potentially. And the Gerald Ford was deployed with 5 destroyers. It's not clear if they're all going to also go to the Caribbean. Some of them are currently in the Red Sea. Others have left the Mediterranean as well. So we'll see what force ends up making it over there. It's expected to get to the Caribbean in less than a week. They move pretty quick, these aircraft carriers. So again, I mean, this is just huge firepower, much more than needed to bomb these small boats that they've been targeting. And the next one here, the U.S. bombs the 17th alleged drug boat in Latin America. So U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth on Tuesday announced that the U.S. has bombed yet another boat in the waters of Latin America that he claimed, without providing evidence, was carrying drugs in the eastern Pacific Ocean. The strike brings the total numbers of boats that the U.S. has bombed since early September to 17, including 9 that were targeted in the Caribbean and 8 that were hit in the eastern Pacific. He claimed that 2 people were killed, what he calls narco-terrorists, which is the term used to justify these extrajudicial executions at sea. We said all the typical stuff here. And again, we're seeing increasing criticism of this bombing campaign, not just from Democrats, but also from Republicans. And I think that's another factor here when it comes to the Venezuela push. So, I mean, I really hope that these things that are happening, the voters showing that they're not happy with Republicans, the pushback from Republicans in Congress about this bombing campaign makes some difference when it comes to the push toward a regime change war in Venezuela. But it seems like little Marco is still steering the ship on that. All right, so the next one here, Hamas hands over body as IDF strikes Gaza. So Hamas on Tuesday handed over another body of a deceased Israeli soldier to the Red Cross, which transferred the remains to Israel, as the IDF continues to launch attacks in Gaza despite the ceasefire deal. So the body was later confirmed to be Itai Che, who is an IDF soldier with Israeli and U.S. citizenship, who was killed when his tank unit was attacked on October 7th, 2023, and his body was taken into Gaza. So now there are 7 Israeli bodies that remain somewhere under the rubble in Gaza. And if you remember, the Israeli government initially tried to blow up the ceasefire deal after Hamas did not immediately have all of the bodies, even though it was clear that they wouldn't have them right away and that it would take time to find them. And the deal actually included a mechanism for that. But they've continued to dig them out and hand them over. And now Israeli media is reporting initially, again, before even the deal was signed, Israeli officials were saying that they might not be able to find all the bodies. But now, according to the latest Israeli reports, they believe that they're going to be able to recover all of them through strenuous work and cooperation with Hamas. That was the quote from the Israeli media report. So Israel has handed over 15 Palestinian bodies for each Israeli body that has been recovered. And who knows, I don't know how many bodies of dead Palestinians that Israel has. It's, nobody is talking about that. So while Hamas has continued to work to recover the Israeli bodies, the IDF has continued its attacks in Gaza. According to Al Jazeera, at least 2 Palestinians were killed on Tuesday, one who was shot by an Israeli quadcopter drone in eastern Gaza City, and another who was killed by Israeli army fire in Jabalia, northern Gaza. The IDF acknowledged one attack, making the usual claim that someone crossed the yellow line. So they had, that's it. That means you're marked for death. Gaza's health ministry said that since the ceasefire went into effect, Israeli attacks have killed 240 people and injured 607. So this is like Lebanon, on a bigger scale when it comes to the violence and the killing. Basically since the November 2024 ceasefire deal was signed in Lebanon, Israel hasn't stopped the attacks on the country. But they're both essentially de-escalation deals, and who knows where this whole Gaza thing is going to go with that stuff I covered yesterday about this international force, this UN Security Council resolution that'll basically give the U.S. authority to govern Gaza. I just can't imagine this stuff working out and leading to any kind of real peace. But hoping for the best, of course. The next one here, the U.S. is asking Israel to allow foreign journalists to enter Gaza. So the Trump administration is asking Israel to allow foreign journalists to enter Gaza. The Times of Israel reported on Monday, citing 2 U.S. officials. President Trump said publicly back in August that Israel should allow foreign press into Gaza, and the report said that the U.S. has renewed the request in the wake of the ceasefire deal, which Israel has repeatedly violated. However, one U.S. official said that the issue is not high on the Trump administration's list of priorities, signaling that the administration is not applying much pressure, and that Israel may be able to maintain the ban. Israel has maintained the ban since October 7, 2023, besides a few controlled visits of journalists who were embedded with the IDF. Like guys like Douglas Murray have gotten in there with the IDF, pro-Israeli propagandists. I know in one case, a CNN team went in and they did a story about how Israel was destroying graveyards in Gaza, and then that was it. They didn't let any other journalists enter like that. This picture here is of 2 Palestinian journalists who were killed by the IDF back in August when they did the double tap bombing strike on the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis, southern Gaza, that was live on TV during a broadcast. The second strike hit. The total of 5 journalists were killed. I forget what Israel's claim. Oh, yeah, they claimed that they targeted a Hamas camera. Turned out it was a Reuters camera that was there for a long time, and it was a known spot. This stairwell that they targeted was a known spot for journalists to go to have pictures, live feeds of the city, and to go there to get better cell phone reception and everything. And of course, no accountability, no follow-up from the U.S. or anything about this murder of 5 journalists. Total of 20 Palestinians were killed in the attack. I mean, it's like war crime on top of war crime on top of war crime. A double tap strike on a hospital. It also killed rescue workers that targeted journalists. It's just, man. But anyway, so there's I covered, I think last week, that according to Israeli media, Israel is preparing for a propaganda war for when foreign journalists do come into Gaza. They're worried about human stories, about a lot of just stories about civilians who've suffered in Gaza. And they don't want that stuff to get out there. I mean, for me, and for anyone who watches this show, we've been well aware of what's happening in Gaza because the Palestinian journalists have been reporting on it, the people in Gaza. And over 200 of them have been killed, the journalists. And, of course, people have also seen all this stuff on social media. But I think there is a large group of people, especially in the U.S., that hasn't seen that stuff. And if all the mainstream press, starts getting into Gaza, a lot more people are going to wake up to the reality of what happened there. It's, especially just with the rubble and everything. So Israel is certainly not eager to let that happen. All right, so the next one here, no Jewish terrorists, according to a MK. So this article is from Middle East Eye. So a far-right Israeli lawmaker who sponsored a bill imposing a death penalty for terrorists has said that it will only apply to those who harm the state of Israel and will exclude Jews. When asked whether the law would apply to Jewish attackers, MK Limor San Har Melech said that there's no such thing as a Jewish terrorist. On Monday, an Israeli panel approved the bill, which introduces the death penalty for Palestinian prisoners, paving the way for its first reading in Parliament. The proposal, tabled by National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir's far-right Jewish Power Party, would allow Israeli courts to impose the death penalty on Palestinians convicted of killing Israelis on nationalistic grounds. The legislation does not apply to Israelis who kill Palestinians under similar circumstances. Defending the bill, Har Melech insisted that it's very clear and unequivocal. He said, quote, "There's a simple truth. A dead terrorist is a terrorist who won't return to the cycle of terror," end quote. The Knesset member further accused ex-Israeli Army legal chief Yifat Tomer Yerushalmi, who is currently under investigation for leaking footage apparently showing Israeli soldiers raping a Palestinian detainee, of lying and deceiving the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. So she's targeting her as well. But just think about that. So here's a bill to execute just Palestinians. And, of course, we see murders in the West Bank all the time by Israeli settlers, murders of Palestinians, and nobody ever gets arrested or anything. There's no accountability at all. And Ben-Gvir recently, there's a video of him going around, of him standing above like 5 Palestinian prisoners who were blindfolded with their hands tied behind their back, face down on the ground, saying, "We're going to kill them." This is just such sick stuff. I don't even know what the words are for it. Evil. But this is, again, all supported by our government, the military aid and political support that the U.S. gives to Israel. Just the sickest people are in charge. All right, so the next one here, Israeli attacks on southern Lebanon continue. So this article is from Jason Ditz. So Israel is continuing with its daily attacks on southern Lebanon, and further escalation may be in the offing. And essentially, Israel is just dismissing the idea of diplomacy with Lebanon. Lebanon's been calling for talks. So there was an airstrike in the south against a car. No confirmation of casualty figures. The IDF hasn't put statements out on this. But also another thing that happened, Israeli ground troops crossed the border and demolished a civilian home in one of the villages in the south. And there was no announcement on that either. So we've seen continued airstrikes and incursions on the ground. All right, so the next one here, Iraq's prime minister says that militias can be dismantled once the U.S.-led coalition leaves. So Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani has said that the Iraqi government will bring all weapons under the control of the state once the U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition in the country withdraws. Comments that come as he is under increasing pressure from the U.S. to disarm the Popular Mobilization Forces, or the PMF. And the PMF is a coalition of mostly Shia militias, including groups that are aligned with Iran, that was formed in 2014 to fight ISIS, and it is formally part of Iraq's security forces. So since the major battles with ISIS ended, which really ended in Iraq in 2017, there was still some big stuff going on in Syria until like 2018 or 2019. But since, the major battles stopped, and during those battles, the U.S. and the PMF and Iran were fighting on the same side. This was when the end of the Obama administration and early Trump administration, when their U.S. was launching major airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. But anyway, so since that stopped, there's been sporadic fighting essentially between the PMF and the U.S., which has involved heavy U.S. airstrikes on the PMF, and Iraq was very unhappy about it. And some of these groups, we don't know exactly which ones. It wasn't exactly clear. But after October 7th, in response to U.S. support for Israel, some of these militias, I forget what they called the group, the Iraqi resistance or something, the Islamic resistance of Iraq, started claiming rocket and drone attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria, and that culminated in the killing of 3 U.S. Army and Reserve soldiers in Jordan, Tower 22, which is a secretive base on the Syrian border. So some of the militias in the PMF were involved in that, so the U.S. was bombing them in response, killed dozens of people in Iraq. Some civilians were killed as well, and it was around that time that al-Sudani, the prime minister, said, all right, the U.S. has got to go. This U.S.-led coalition has to go. So now he's saying, in response to these demands to disarm the PMF, I'll do it once you leave. But the thing is that we don't know if the U.S. is actually going to leave. Well, let me just read his quote first. So he said, quote, "There is no ISIS security and stability. Thank God it's there. So give me the excuse for the presence of 86 states in a coalition. Then for sure there will be a clear program to end any arms outside of state institutions. This is the demand of all," end quote. And he said that once the coalition exits Iraq, the militias in the PMF can either join the army, the Iraqi military, or lay down their weapons. So again, I mentioned, so this gets a little complicated maybe. Well, not complicated, but so last year the U.S. and Iraq signed a deal to end the U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition in Iraq. When the Biden administration's Pentagon signed that deal, they said, this is not a withdrawal. We are not withdrawing. We're going to keep troops in Iraq under a bilateral security partnership. We're just going to end the coalition. But every report you read about this, including this was an interview he did with Reuters, and they said that U.S. troops are going to be gone by September 2026. But under the deal, that's not the case. The coalition is going to end its mission. Other foreign troops are going to leave. The U.S. is going to draw down troops. But the U.S. is planning to keep troops, as far as I understand it. And we saw recently a drawdown of U.S. troops in Iraq, but the Pentagon is saying that they're keeping them at the Ain al-Assad Air Base, at a base in Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, and a few advisors in Baghdad for now. Now, there could be another drawdown later on, but I think the U.S. is planning to stay. And the thing about al-Sudani is that he's under a lot of pressure to get the U.S. to leave. So even if they don't, I think he's going to try to portray the ending of the coalition as as an end of the foreign military presence. But I don't know if all the factions in Iraq are going to accept that, because a lot of them are against the U.S. Military presence, occupation of Iraq. So, I don't know where things are going to go. But the reason why, you might wonder why, because for years now, especially since the U.S. killed Soleimani, the Iranian general in Baghdad, who they also killed alongside the leader of the PMF. So the Iraqi factions in the PMF were obviously not happy about that. Since they killed them, they've been calling for the U.S. to leave. The Iraqi parliament voted for the U.S. to leave. So why hasn't the U.S. left? Well, the U.S. could do enormous economic damage to Iraq. They control their money, essentially their offshore reserves, and can destroy their currency if they wanted to, and can hurt their economy in other ways. They essentially are holding the country hostage, really. And al-Sudani, he was saying also that there's all these he's happy about American companies have been investing more in Iraq and in the oil and everything. So I think he's kind of talking about that stuff to play to Trump a bit. All right, so the next one here, Yemen will inevitably head toward a new round against Israel, according to al-Houthi. So this article is from The Cradle. So the leader of Ansar Allah, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, said in a speech on November 4th that Yemen has emerged stronger after 2 years of war with Israel, warning that a new and full-scale confrontation will inevitably erupt at some point. He said, quote, "We emerged from this round stronger than before on all levels, and we are inevitably heading into a new round of confrontation with the enemy. We are inevitably heading toward a full-scale confrontation with the enemy because stability will not remain in the region so long as the occupation continues in Palestine, end quote. And I read something recently that the Houthis, their military wing, has like really grown in the past couple of years. People have really rallied around them in Yemen. So these airstrikes, major bombing campaign that the U.S. conducted, did not, killed a lot of civilians, killed a lot of people, but it didn't do anything to really hurt them. All right, so the next one here, Hegseth visits the DMZ and praises South Korea's military spending. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth traveled to South Korea, visited the border with North Korea, and met top-level officials. Hegseth lauded Seoul for planning to increase its military budget. Hegseth told reporters that he was greatly encouraged by South Korea's proposal to increase military spending by over 8%. He continued, quote, "We face, as we both acknowledge, a dangerous security environment, but our alliance is stronger than ever," end quote. He said that the U.S.-South Korea alliance remains focused on North Korea, but added that American troops would have the flexibility to combat other threats in the region. Obviously, he's talking about China with that. So this is something Trump, I think, in his first administration was trying to get like South Korea and Japan to pay more for the U.S. military presence in those countries. And I guess South Korea is saying that they're going to do some of that. I don't know. Has there been any reports? I feel like I read something about potentially pulling out a few thousand troops from South Korea, but that might have been a while ago because, you think the China Hawks want to keep them there. But anyway, this is Hegseth's trip to Asia, kind of following up on Trump, who was just there. The next one here, the U.S. issues new North Korea sanctions and pressures the UNSC to follow. So this one is also from the Cradle. So the U.S. Treasury Department announced on November 4th new sanctions on 8 individuals and 2 entities accused of laundering funds for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea through cybercrime and IT worker fraud schemes. The measures target alleged banking networks and companies said to have helped move millions of dollars in cryptocurrency to finance Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs. So these are new U.S. sanctions on North Korea, and they're saying that the UN Security Council should increase the sanctions. And obviously Trump did not meet with Kim while he was in Asia. There's not really any sign that we're going to move toward any sort of diplomacy there, at least at the moment, or at least that we're aware of. All right, so the last story here, Dick Cheney, architect of endless war, dead at 84. So this is Kelly Vlahos's piece. Kelly Vlahos and Jim Loeb wrote this together at Responsible Statecraft. A good background on Cheney and obviously his legacy, for Iraq and torture and starting the war on terror. This is what he's going to be remembered for. I mean, I read some obituaries of him, like I forget which news outlet it was, but it was kind of making it seem like, oh, well, some of the intelligence, with Iraq, it wasn't really clear, but, it is known that he helped lie the U.S. into that disastrous and criminal war, and that's what he's going to be remembered for. And we have a really good piece too from Alan Mosley, Dick Cheney, The Dark Legacy of a War Criminal, about his history. And again, I mean, Cheney's just one of those figures that, in a way, there's a lot of people to blame for the war in Iraq. He really gets a lot of it, I think for good reason. But it's just amazing. I forgot until people were talking about it today on Twitter that he endorsed Kamala Harris, that he, essentially became a Democrat at the end of his life. And I saw Kurt Mills from the American Conservative had a good tweet, kind of, some interesting things to observe about the end of Dick Cheney's life, his last few years. He endorsed the Democrats. He endorsed Harris. But at the same time, Trump bombed Iran. I mean, which is something Cheney always dreamed of doing. And he's pushing toward this, war in Venezuela now. So it's like on one hand, he's been repudiated by kind of the new Republican Party, but at the same time, they're still waging wars that he would be on board with. So it's kind of a mixed bag. But anyway, go check that out by Alan. And then we have a piece from David Gornatsky. Tucker Carlson dines with Zacchaeus about his the backlash of his interview with Nick Fuentes. One from James Carden, World War Gorka. One from Salah Al-Ajail, Iraq War. I was tortured at Abu Ghraib. After 20 years, I'm still seeking justice. Another thing that is part of Dick Cheney's legacy, Abu Ghraib and the torture. And then our spotlight from Ted Snyder. Did Ukraine just quietly attack 2 European nations about some explosions, suspicious explosions that happened in Hungary and Romania? But anyway, that is it. Lots of stuff. Also stuff in the lower part of the page and in our blog. So go visit antiwar.com and like and subscribe and comment and follow us on social media. I think I figure out the bug with the uploading on YouTube that I shouldn't have any problems anymore. But anyway, I'm trying to think. I feel like I had something else to tell you, but I cannot remember at this moment. So I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.